She had not eaten in 2 days, yet her voice trembled with urgency as she screamed across the marble restaurant floor. The billionaire turned, irritated, until he saw her eyes, wide with terror. Everyone laughed at the homeless black girl who dared interrupt their dinner. But when she pointed to his plate, everything changed. In that moment, the laughter stopped. His hand froze in midair. What she revealed next would shatter the illusion of privilege, peel back a truth he was never meant to know, and expose the quiet cruelty hidden beneath their polished smiles. If this story moved you, if it made you think about how easily we judge and how little we truly see, then stay with us. Subscribe to Racism Untold Stories for more untold stories that challenge prejudice, awaken empathy, and remind us that humanity begins when judgment ends. The morning sun had barely risen over the city skyline when Margaret began her walk toward the downtown district. The air was sharp and cold, filled with the scent of rain that had fallen overnight. Her clothes clung damply to her thin frame, and her shoes were torn at the edges. But she walked with quiet determination. The streets were already alive with motion, expensive cars gliding past puddles, well-dressed strangers gripping coffee cups, and the faint hum of ambition echoing from glass towers above her. She was invisible to them. The people who walked by did not meet her eyes. They looked through her, past her, or around her, as if her presence disturbed the order of their morning routine. To them, she was another forgotten soul in a city that measured worth by status. To her, they were reminders of a world she once belonged to. A few months ago, Margaret had a life that felt safe. She had a small apartment, a job as a cleaner in a private medical laboratory, and a mother whose laughter filled their one-room home. But when her mother's illness worsened, Margaret spent every dollar she earned on medicine and hospital visits. One night, her supervisor accused her of theft after a box of lab supplies went missing. She pleaded her innocence, but no one listened. Security escorted her out of the building that same night, and she was never called back. Without work, rent piled up, and soon the locks on her door were changed. Now every day was a silent battle for survival. She learned which streets offered warmth at night and which store owners chased her away. Her stomach often ached with hunger, but she had learned to ignore it. Hunger became as natural as breathing. That morning, the city was preparing for an event. Banners hung across the main avenue, and men in suits moved briskly toward the Royal Dean, an exclusive restaurant that towered above the street like a palace. It was said that only the richest of the rich ever set foot there. Margaret often passed by its back alley, where discarded food sometimes landed in the trash before closing hours. She stood across the street, watching as a group of reporters gathered outside. Cameras flashed, and a black limousine stopped by the golden entrance. From it stepped Eleanor Rowe, a woman known in every newspaper as the Steel Rose, a billionaire philanthropist whose foundation funded schools, hospitals, and art museums. Her name was spoken with admiration, her face printed on magazine covers, her voice quoted in charity speeches. Margaret remembered cleaning the floors of that laboratory while hearing staff talk about her. Some called her generous. Others said she was calculating, a woman who gave with one hand and took with the other. But Margaret did not care for rumors. What she cared about now was food, and she hoped that by waiting until the lunch rush passed, she could search through the restaurant's trash for leftovers. As she stood near the corner, her eyes caught something unusual, a familiar crate being carried through the back entrance. It was the same kind of box she used to handle at the lab, stamped with the same discreet cereal label. Her heart began to race. That label was only printed on experimental produce, crops that were being genetically tested for toxicity. They were never meant for sale, never meant for consumption. The color of the crate confirmed it. Bright red, a warning indicator. Margaret froze. The porter carrying it disappeared inside the kitchen, unaware of what he was holding. her mind filled with the memory of the day she lost her job, the day she was blamed for misplacing one of those very boxes. She knew exactly what those crates contained. A batch of test vegetables sprayed with a new chemical compound still under review. She remembered the label code, Series 47B, dangerous, unapproved. For a moment, she doubted her own eyes. Perhaps she was mistaken. Perhaps exhaustion had blurred her memory. But then she saw it clearly again. The red label, the lab's insignia, and the code that haunted her since that night. She tried to calm herself, but a deep fear gripped her chest. What was it doing here, at a restaurant like this? Who had sent it? If those ingredients ended up in the kitchen, someone could be seriously harmed. She wanted to warn someone, but she knew how people reacted when she tried to speak. Her words carried no weight. Her face carried no privilege. Hours passed as she lingered near the alley, debating whether to act. Rain began to drizzle again, soaking her thin jacket. Inside the restaurant, elegant guests arrived, stepping out of cars and into the warm, golden light of the dining hall. Waiters in crisp uniforms glided between tables, carrying plates that looked like art. The billionaire sat near the center, surrounded by journalists and investors. A photographer captured her laughter as she lifted her glass of champagne. Margaret's hunger gnawed at her, but fear gnawed harder. She knew she should walk away, yet something inside her would not let her. The memory of her mother's voice echoed in her mind, gentle, firm, and full of quiet courage. If you see danger, speak. Even if no one listens, speak. By the time the clock struck 1, the rain had turned to mist. Margaret could see through the restaurant's grand windows. A waiter carried a plate toward the billionaire's table, a dish garnished with bright green vegetables, the very kind that had come from that crate. Her pulse quickened. She stepped closer, her reflection merging with the glass. Inside, Eleanor Rose smiled as cameras clicked. Her fork hovered above the meal. Everyone's attention was on her, on the poised woman about to take her first bite. Outside, Margaret's voice cracked through the air. She shouted with all the strength her frail body could summon. Her words tore through the chatter and laughter, startling the entire hall into silence. Heads turned toward the window. Every eye fell on her drenched figure, her trembling hands, her desperate expression. The world that had ignored her now stared at her in disbelief. The billionaire frowned, irritated at the interruption. Security began to move, but Margaret's eyes did not leave the plate. Her chest heaved, her throat burned, and fear twisted her stomach, not for herself, but for what she knew was about to happen if someone did not stop her from eating. Her hunger no longer mattered. What mattered was stopping the danger she had seen before it was too late. And in that moment, in that single cry from a forgotten soul, the line between privilege and desperation blurred into something terrifyingly human. The sound of Margaret's scream hung in the air, cutting through the polite chatter like a blade. Inside the restaurant, forks clattered against plates. Conversations halted mid-sentence. For a moment, the opulent dining hall felt hollow, as if every breath had been stolen by her desperate cry. Outside, the rain blurred her face against the glass, turning her outline into something ghostly, a trembling shadow between two worlds. Eleanor Rowe blinked, her composure cracking ever so slightly. The billionaire had faced journalists, scandals, and courtroom battles, yet something about the raw terror in that woman's voice pierced deeper than anything words could explain. She glanced toward her plate again, then toward the guards rushing to remove the intruder. The vegetables gleamed under the chandelier, bright, green, and harmless to any ordinary eye. But Margaret's gaze never left them. Security stormed through the doors, their steps echoing across the marble floor. Outside, Margaret stumbled backward as they approached. She knew what would come next, accusations of madness, trespassing, disruption. But she could not remain silent. Each step they took toward her tightened the panic in her chest. Inside, a waiter hesitated beside the billionaire's table. He leaned in, whispering something uncertain. The tension grew thick enough to silence the whispers of the entire room. Reporters began snapping photographs again, eager for scandal. Through the misted glass, Margaret's figure looked like a dark omen against the golden light of wealth and comfort. Her heart pounded with memory. That night in the laboratory, the red warning lights flashing, her supervisor shouting about missing supplies. She could still see the crate being sealed, her name scribbled on the shift report that was later used to accuse her. The words, "unauthorized removal," still haunted her. But she had never touched that crate. Someone else had moved it, someone with power, someone who had reason to bury the truth. The billionaire signaled for the guards to stop. She was curious now. Few people dared to challenge her, and none had ever done so with such fear in their voice. The restaurant had become a stage, and the homeless girl outside was at its center. Cameras turned. Guests whispered. Every face watched as Eleanor rose from her chair and walked toward the window. Margaret pressed her palms to the glass, her breath fogging the surface. Her voice trembled as she tried to speak again, but no one could hear her words through the thick barrier between them. All she could do was point. To the plate, to the green garnish that shimmered under the soft light. Her eyes pleaded wide with urgency. The billionaire frowned, annoyed yet uneasy. She gestured for the plate to be taken away. The waiter complied quickly, but the moment had already fractured the illusion of the evening. Reporters whispered questions, and phones began recording. Margaret was pulled back from the window as two guards grabbed her by the arms. She struggled weakly, rain soaking her hair, her feet sliding against the pavement. But even as they dragged her away, her voice rose again, not with words of defiance but of warning. She kept pointing toward the kitchen entrance, shouting through the storm. Inside, Eleanor hesitated. Something about that desperate persistence unsettled her. She turned toward the restaurant manager, demanding to know where the vegetables had come from. The man stuttered. He mentioned a new supplier, a private company offering rare organic produce. Eleanor's brow furrowed. Her foundation had funded several agricultural labs, including one that conducted chemical trials. She had signed those contracts herself. A faint chill crept through her. She asked for the invoice, the shipment receipt. When the manager handed her the document, her eyes froze on a familiar insignia printed beside the batch code, Series 47B. The same code that had once triggered controversy years ago when an internal lab report warned of potential toxicity. That report had been silenced under confidentiality. She felt a wave of nausea twist through her stomach. Her mind began piecing together what it meant. Those vegetables were not supposed to exist outside controlled testing. If they had reached her restaurant, someone had broken the chain of safety protocols. Someone had betrayed the trust of everyone who believed in her public image of integrity. Outside, the guards held Margaret beneath the awning. Rainwater streamed down her face, mixing with tears. She expected punishment, humiliation, or maybe arrest. But instead, a figure appeared at the door. Eleanor stepped outside, shielded by an umbrella held by an assistant. The billionaire's heels clicked softly against the wet pavement as she approached. Margaret looked up, shivering. She could see the suspicion in the woman's eyes, but beneath it, something else. The beginning of doubt. Eleanor studied her face closely, and for a fleeting second, recognition flickered. She had seen her before, not as a stranger on the street, but in a personnel report years ago. The young lab worker dismissed for theft. The name surfaced in her memory. Margaret Ellis. The billionaire's pulse quickened. She dismissed the guards with a quiet motion. The reporters, still filming, dared not interrupt. For the first time in years, Eleanor's practiced calm faltered. Inside her mind, connections formed rapidly. The missing crate, the sealed investigation, the quiet hush that followed. She remembered the day she was advised to approve a report that absolved the company of wrongdoing. The recommendation came from one of her executives, a man who insisted the incident was minor. She never questioned it. Now she began to see what her silence had cost someone else. Margaret tried to speak, but her voice was broken by exhaustion. Her words came in fragments, trembling, soaked through with disbelief that someone was finally listening. She explained what she had seen that morning, the crate marked with the lab's code carried into the restaurant. The billionaire's face grew pale. She turned to the restaurant manager, demanding that every crate in the kitchen be checked immediately. Within minutes, workers brought out boxes identical to the one Margaret had seen. The red labels glowed faintly under the lights, stamped with the unmistakable mark of the laboratory. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Cameras flashed again. Margaret's body swayed from fatigue. The adrenaline that had carried her began to fade. But inside, a fragile sense of vindication began to grow. For the first time since her dismissal, someone believed her. Eleanor stood silent, the rain dripping from her umbrella. Her empire had been built on the promise of ethics and compassion, yet the proof before her eyes revealed something uglier. The foundation she prided herself on had become a mask for negligence. The very food served to her guests was tainted with the consequences of silence. Her silence. Margaret felt her knees weaken. The billionaire gestured for her to be taken inside, out of the cold. The staff hesitated, unsure if they should let a homeless woman into a place like this, but Eleanor's tone left no room for question. Inside, warmth enveloped her. The guests watched, unsure how to react. Cameras kept rolling, capturing a moment that would soon spread across every platform. The billionaire and the homeless woman standing side by side, both shaken by the same truth. As Margaret's trembling hand rested against the back of a chair, she realized something profound. The barrier between them had never been just glass or privilege. It had been the world's willingness to believe appearances over truth. Outside, the rain washed the city clean, though its streets still reflected the shimmer of inequality. Inside, a reckoning had begun, one that neither of them could escape. The dining hall had fallen into complete silence. The weight of revelation hung heavy in the air, denser than the rain outside. Guests exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether to stay seated or leave. Reporters had stopped pretending to be discreet. Cameras hovered like vultures waiting for a collapse. Eleanor Rowe stood motionless in the center of the room, staring at the crates that had been laid bare before her. Each red label was a quiet accusation, every printed code a reminder of negligence that now stood exposed beneath the golden chandeliers of her empire. Margaret sat in a chair near the entrance, wrapped in a blanket that one of the waiters had hesitantly offered. Her clothes were soaked, her hair clung to her face, and her breathing was shallow. Yet despite her frailty, there was a strange dignity in the way she held herself, as if she had carried the truth for so long that even exhaustion could not take it from her now. Eleanor's assistant whispered frantically into her ear, suggesting they end the event, clear the room, and handle the matter privately. But Eleanor knew that the world was already watching. Every guest, every journalist, every employee with a smartphone had captured the moment a homeless black woman had exposed the flaw in her empire. The story had already escaped beyond her control. Her vision blurred as the flash of cameras grew brighter. For years, she had lived inside a fortress of admiration, convinced that her wealth could be a shield against guilt. Now that shield had cracked. The reflection staring back from the restaurant's mirrored wall was not that of a philanthropist or visionary. It was the image of someone who had looked away when the truth was inconvenient. The restaurant manager returned with shaking hands, holding another receipt. His face had turned pale. "Madam," he said quietly, "the produce came directly from Rowe Biofoods." The name made her stomach turn. Rowe Biofoods was one of her subsidiaries, the same company that had absorbed the smaller lab after a quiet merger 2 years earlier. Margaret's eyes lifted. weak but focused. She had always suspected that the stolen crate had not disappeared randomly. It had been redirected, rerouted, hidden under the paperwork of expansion and investment. And now the evidence sat openly before them. The guests began murmuring. The words toxic, cover-up, and testing slipped through the air like small fires spreading through dry grass. Eleanor turned toward her assistant, demanding to know who authorized the use of experimental produce. The assistant stammered, mumbling the name of an executive, one of her longest-serving advisors, a man she trusted implicitly. As if summoned by guilt, the man himself emerged from the crowd. His suit was immaculate, his face calm, but his eyes darted nervously toward the reporters, i.e., he insisted that there must have been a clerical mistake, that the wrong shipment was delivered by accident. His voice carried the smooth rhythm of corporate defense, but Margaret's hoarse whisper cut through it with more power than any accusation. She reminded him of the night he fired her. She described the missing crate, the accusation of theft, and the dismissal that destroyed her life. She told the room how she had pleaded for a hearing, how she had sent letters that were never answered. Her words trembled, yet they struck with the precision of truth. The executive's composure began to falter. He turned toward Eleanor, his expression pleading for intervention. But Eleanor remained silent. It was as if every decision she had ever made in comfort and denial now stood on trial before her. The crowd pressed closer. Cameras flashed again. Someone began recording live, streaming the unfolding chaos to thousands who would soon multiply into millions. Eleanor could feel the air grow heavier with judgment. Every eye in the room demanded a reaction, an admission, an apology, or an escape. Her assistant whispered again that she could walk away, that her legal team would contain the damage. But something inside her refused. The sound of Margaret's trembling voice still echoed in her mind. The voice of someone who had suffered because she chose to sign without reading, to delegate without care, to trust without accountability. Eleanor walked toward the crates. Her heels clicked slowly against the floor. She tore off one of the labels with her bare hands and stared at the code printed across it. The ink smeared under her thumb, but the numbers were unmistakable. She turned toward the guests, her voice low but clear enough for the room to hear. "These were never approved for human consumption," she said. "They contain untested compounds meant for controlled trials. Whoever allowed this shipment to pass inspection has committed a crime." The executive tried to speak again, insisting that she had approved the purchase order. But Eleanor's voice hardened. She told the truth, that the entire company, including her, had failed to follow through on the chain of accountability. She had signed without question. She had trusted the wrong people. And because of that, a woman had been left homeless and accused of theft to cover someone else's greed. Her confession rippled through the crowd like a shockwave. The executives at the table looked down in silence. The reporters' fingers danced furiously across their keyboards. Margaret closed her eyes, her body trembling from exhaustion and disbelief. For years, she had prayed for someone to listen. Now, the world was listening. A commotion broke out near the doorway as police officers arrived, alerted by the public disturbance. They were followed by health inspectors, summoned by someone in the restaurant. The scene had transformed from luxury to investigation within minutes. Evidence was photographed, samples were taken, and as the officers questioned the staff, Margaret sat quietly, watching the empire that had crushed her begin to collapse under the weight of its own deception. Eleanor answered every question without protest. She gave them the company's name, the storage locations, and the list of executives responsible for shipments. There was no attempt to hide, no effort to redirect blame. For the first time in her life, she did not speak to defend her image. She spoke to face the truth. As the officers led the executive away for questioning, his eyes met Margaret's. His expression shifted from arrogance to fear. She did not speak to him. There was nothing left to say. When the chaos settled, The billionaire sank into one of the empty chairs near the window. The once vibrant restaurant felt hollow now, stripped of pretense and music. Her reflection stared back at her, older, heavier with guilt, stripped of every illusion of grace. Margaret sat across from her, still wrapped in the blanket. Between them stood the remnants of the meal that had nearly become a silent tragedy. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the rain tapping against the glass and the distant hum of sirens outside. In that silence, Eleanor finally understood what her wealth had never allowed her to feel: the fragility of another person's life, the sharp edge of survival that privilege could never comprehend. And Margaret, despite her exhaustion, saw something unfamiliar in the woman before her. Not pity, but remorse. Genuine, painful remorse. Outside, the last of the reporters departed. The rain eased into a soft drizzle, washing the city's streets in silver light. Inside, two women sat in the wreckage of truth, one stripped of power, the other quietly reclaimed by it. For Margaret, this was not victory. It was justice, long delayed, finally seen in the open. For Eleanor, it was the beginning of an unraveling, not of fortune, but of identity. She had built her empire on a promise of compassion. Now she would have to learn what that word truly meant. The night grew darker, but in the silence that followed, the truth no longer hid in the shadows. Days turned into weeks, and the headlines refused to fade. The story of the homeless girl who saved a billionaire's dinner flooded every major news outlet. Commentators debated morality, privilege, and accountability. Some defended Eleanor Rowe's confession as a rare act of honesty. Others called it too little, too late. But for Margaret, none of the noise mattered. For the first time in years, she slept beneath a roof that did not leak, in a bed that belonged to her. The hospital room where she recovered was quiet. Sunlight filtered through the window each morning, washing her frail hands in warmth. Nurses spoke to her kindly now, addressing her by name instead of glancing past her. For weeks she had been invisible. Now people visited, not to pity her, but to thank her. Yet even as they called her brave, she remained uneasy. Bravery was not what she had felt that day. It was terror and a desperate will to be heard before silence cost another life. Across the city, Eleanor Rowe faced a different kind of reckoning. Her board had convened an emergency meeting, investors demanded explanations, and prosecutors began to investigate the company's negligence. The fortress she had built around her reputation was gone. Yet beneath the ruins, something unexpected began to grow: humility. She spent her days reading every report, every ignored complaint, every dismissed whistleblower claim. Each page revealed a layer of her blindness. She had surrounded herself with polished words and polite deceit, all designed to protect her image while silencing those beneath her. The realization cut deeper than public shame. It tore at the foundation of who she believed she was. Weeks later, Eleanor walked through the community shelter on the outskirts of the city. Cameras were not allowed inside. There were no press releases, no carefully prepared statements. The shelter had recently reopened with new funding, not from her foundation, but from her personal fortune. She insisted it carry no plaque with her name. Margaret sat near a window there, reading an old newspaper folded neatly on her lap. She had gained a little weight, her cheeks softer, her posture steadier. When Eleanor entered, the room fell silent. No one expected the billionaire to return to the place where her empire's shame had begun. But she came quietly, without entourage or security. She approached Margaret, stopping a few feet away. The two women studied each other for a long moment. There were no grand gestures, no words of apology rehearsed for the public. There was only the heavy human silence between two lives that had collided by accident, but been forever changed by truth. Eleanor spoke softly, her voice stripped of the confidence that once commanded boardrooms. She did not ask for forgiveness. She offered acknowledgement. She told Margaret she had read her employment file, her letters of protest, and the internal memo that had been buried to protect the company. She admitted her failure, not as a leader, but as a human being who had let convenience silence compassion. Margaret listened, her expression unreadable. Then, after a long pause, she nodded once. "The truth found you," she said quietly. "That is all I ever wanted." Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes. The simplicity of those words held more weight than any courtroom judgment. Truth had found her, and it had not come from wealth, status, or power. It had come from a voice the world had dismissed. Over the next months, Eleanor dismantled Rowe Biofoods entirely. The factories closed, and their profits were redirected to independent labs for safe agricultural research. She sold off her luxury estate and used the money to fund grassroots programs focused on food security in low-income neighborhoods. But unlike before, she no longer appeared at ribbon cuttings or interviews. She stayed in the background, working quietly. The press called it a fall from grace. Eleanor called it a return to humanity. Margaret chose not to pursue legal action. Her name was cleared publicly, and her story was documented in investigative reports that exposed years of systemic negligence and class bias. A nonprofit organization offered her a job, not as a symbol, but as an advisor for community advocacy. She accepted, wanting to help others who had been silenced by the cruelty of disbelief. She no longer walked the streets with her head lowered. When she passed through the city now, people recognized her. Some thanked her. Others avoided her eyes, ashamed of how they might have looked past her once. But Margaret had learned that forgiveness was not weakness. It was strength, the kind that comes only after surviving humiliation and rising without hatred. In time, Eleanor and Margaret crossed paths again, not in a restaurant or a boardroom, but at a small community garden funded by the shelter. The soil was rich and dark beneath their hands as they planted the first seedlings. The billionaire knelt beside the woman who had once been cast aside, their hands working side by side. No photographers captured it. There were no witnesses, only the sound of shovels cutting through earth, and the quiet, healing rhythm of beginning again. For both women, the experience had stripped away illusions. Margaret no longer believed the world would always see her truth. Eleanor no longer believed that charity could cleanse the harm of silence. Yet in that garden, under the open sky, they shared something neither wealth nor poverty could define: the simple act of rebuilding, rooted in honesty. The world moved on, as it always does. New scandals replaced old ones. The city's lights burned brighter, and the streets filled once again with faces that hurried past one another without seeing. But for those who remembered that story, of a homeless girl who shouted in fear, and a billionaire who finally listened, it became more than a headline. It became a mirror. It reminded them that sometimes the voices we ignore carry the wisdom that could save us all. If this story made you pause, if it opened your eyes to how power blinds and silence destroys, then do not let it fade when the screen goes dark. Subscribe to Racism, Untold Stories, and stay with us as we reveal more truths the world tries to overlook. Every story we tell is a voice once ignored. Every voice deserves to be heard. Because real change begins the moment you choose to listen.